What if history had gone differently? Imagine a world where Adolf Hitler's dream of global domination came true. A world where the swastika isn't a symbol of hate from the past, but the flag flying over your government buildings. A world where democracy, freedom, and equality never had a chance to thrive. This isn't just a fantasy. At several points during World War II, Nazi victory was terrifyingly possible. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most chilling alternate histories ever imagined. What if the Nazis actually won World War II? How close were they? To answer what might have happened, we need to understand how close the Nazis came to winning. By 1940, Germany had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, nearly all of Western Europe. The only major opponent left in Europe was Britain, and when the Luftwaffe bombed London night after night, invasion was a real possibility. In 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the largest military operation in history. Had they captured Moscow before winter, the USSR could have collapsed. And remember, America only entered the war after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. If Japan had delayed, or if the US had stayed neutral, Nazi Germany could have consolidated its empire before facing American opposition. In other words, victory was not unthinkable, it was a razor's edge. The Nazi plan for Europe. So what would a Nazi-controlled Europe look like? Hitler's vision was called the Greater Germanic Reich. Western Europe, France, Belgium, the Netherlands would become German protectorates, controlled by puppet governments loyal to Berlin. Eastern Europe was a different story. Hitler called it Lebensraum, or living space. Millions of Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians would be displaced, enslaved, or exterminated. German settlers would take their land. The Nazis also planned the General Plan Ost, a blueprint for the systematic removal of up to 50 million people from Eastern Europe over several decades. In this Europe, Jewish people would have been completely wiped out. The Holocaust, we know, was only the beginning of what they intended. Culture, politics, and freedom would vanish, replaced with one-party rule, state-controlled propaganda, and the SS enforcing loyalty through terror. Britain falls, America isolated. Let's take it further. Imagine if Germany had defeated Britain. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, would have turned London into a Nazi stronghold. Winston Churchill likely would have been executed or forced into exile in Canada. Without Britain as a base, the United States would lose its closest ally in Europe. Franklin Roosevelt may have faced pressure to stay out of a hopeless war, especially with many Americans already opposing involvement. In this alternate timeline, the US might have signed a peace treaty with Germany, leaving the Nazis in control of Europe, while America stayed isolated across the Atlantic. Think about that. No D-Day, no Allied liberation, just a Europe under the swastika, and an America powerless to change it. Nazi science and technology. One of the most chilling aspects of a Nazi victory is their advanced science. Germany already created the world's first jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me 262. They built V-2 rockets capable of striking London from hundreds of miles away. Nazi scientists were experimenting with long-range bombers that could have reached the United States, and there are indications that they were pursuing nuclear research. Now imagine this: a Nazi atomic bomb dropped on New York, London, or Moscow. In our reality, it was the US that developed the bomb first, ending the war with Japan. But in this alternate timeline, the Nazis could have become the first nuclear power, ensuring their dominance for decades. The Cold War we know, between the US and the USSR, might instead have been between the US and Nazi Germany, if America was even strong enough to compete. Nazi global empire. What about the rest of the world? Nazi Germany was allied with Imperial Japan. If both powers had triumphed, the globe might have been split in two. Germany controlling Europe, Africa and the Middle East, while Japan dominated Asia and the Pacific. In Africa, the Nazis planned to exploit natural resources and enslave millions. In the Middle East, control of oil would fuel their empire indefinitely. Eventually, conflict between Germany and Japan might have been inevitable. But for decades, humanity could have lived under two vast authoritarian empires. Instead of the post-war boom, the United Nations and the spread of democracy, the 20th century might have been remembered as the age of fascist empires. Daily life under Nazi rule. Let's bring this nightmare closer to home. What would life look like for ordinary people in a Nazi-dominated world? If you were German or considered part of the so-called Aryan race, you might enjoy comfort but under strict control. Your children would be raised in the Hitler Youth, taught loyalty to the Reich above family or faith. If you belonged to a persecuted group, Jews, Roma, Slavs, LGBTQ+, people with disabilities, your life would mean slavery or death. Art, literature, and film would all be censored. Jazz, modern art, and anything labeled degenerate would disappear. Only Nazi-approved culture would survive. The vibrant diversity of human expression? Gone, replaced by grey uniformity and endless propaganda. Could the Reich last? But here's the big question: could the Nazi Empire actually last? History shows us that regimes built on fear and violence eventually collapse. The larger the empire, the harder it is to control. The Nazis would have faced endless resistance movements across Europe. Governing Russia with its vast land and people would have been nearly impossible. And technologically, the world doesn't stop advancing. Even if the Nazis suppressed free thought, eventually new ideas, inventions, and uprisings would have cracked their grip. So yes, they might have ruled for decades, but like every empire before them, they would have eventually fallen, leaving behind a trail of destruction unlike anything in human history. Alternate history in culture. This terrifying scenario has inspired countless works of fiction, from novels like The Man in the High Castle to video games like Wolfenstein. Artists and writers have long explored this dark what if. These stories fascinate us because they remind us just how fragile freedom really is and how close the world came to being lost. Conclusion. As we step away from this chilling alternate history, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Freedom is never guaranteed, and the world we live in today exists only because people in the past chose to fight for it when surrender seemed easier. Imagine the weight of that choice. Soldiers storming the beaches of Normandy under heavy fire, knowing many would not survive the first few minutes. Resistance fighters in occupied France or Poland secretly passing messages, printing underground newspapers, or sabotaging railroads while knowing that capture meant torture or death. Families hiding Jewish neighbors in attics and barns, living every day under the shadow of discovery. Their bravery was not abstract. It was lived, moment by moment, decision by decision, by ordinary men and women who refused to surrender to tyranny. The victory of the Allies was not inevitable, and the cost was staggering. Entire cities like Warsaw, Stalingrad, and Dresden reduced to ruins, tens of millions of lives lost, and generations scarred by war. Yet from that suffering rose the framework of the world we inhabit now, the spread of democracy, the recognition of universal human rights, the rebuilding of nations, and the birth of institutions like the United Nations, designed to prevent global catastrophe from happening again. If the Nazis had triumphed, the 20th century might have been remembered as the age of fascist empires, with democracy erased, diversity exterminated, and entire cultures silenced. But instead it became a century of recovery, resilience, and progress. This contrast offers us both a warning and a lesson. The danger of extremism never truly vanishes. The ideas that fueled the Nazi rise, hatred of difference, the obsession with racial purity, the lure of authoritarian power, still exist in corners of the world today, sometimes subtle, sometimes obvious, waiting for moments of fear and division to spread again. History shows us that dictators do not rise alone. They rise because ordinary people allow them to, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of indifference, sometimes out of misplaced hope. The fall of the Nazis reminds us that vigilance is not optional. Every generation must recognize and resist the beginnings of hate before it grows into something uncontrollable. And yet, even in reflecting on the horrors of what might have been, we must also acknowledge humanity's extraordinary resilience. After 1945, nations that were once mortal enemies, Germany, Japan, Italy, transformed into allies committed to peace. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe from ashes. Former colonies fought for and won independence. Civil rights movements in America, women's liberation, decolonization in Asia and Africa, the fall of the Berlin Wall. All these movements were shaped, directly or indirectly, by the lessons of World War II and by the determination that such darkness should never be allowed to dominate humanity again. Consider how extraordinary it is that within a single lifetime, the world went from the gas chambers of Auschwitz to humans walking on the moon, from cities flattened by bombs to international cooperation on global challenges. That arc of progress is not automatic. It happened because people chose to resist hate, to rebuild, and to dream bigger than war. And so when we ask, what if the Nazis had won World War II? The answer is terrifying. An empire built on fear and extermination, a world without freedom, a future without diversity or democracy. But the very fact that this nightmare never became real is proof of the courage and sacrifice of millions who refused to let it happen. It is proof that history is not destiny, but choice, and that the choices of one generation can shape the lives of countless others. And this is where the weight of history falls on us today, because though the Nazi Reich collapsed, the forces of hatred, division, and authoritarianism still exist in different forms, and the future will be determined by whether we too resist them or allow them to rise unchecked. The conclusion of this journey is not simply that we should be grateful the Nazis lost. It is that we must remain vigilant so that their vision never has another chance to emerge. The world we live in, with its freedoms, its diversity, its technology, its opportunities, is a fragile inheritance built on sacrifice, and it can be lost if forgotten. So let us remember that history is not just a story about the past, it is a warning about the future. The nightmare of Nazi victory remains only an alternate history, but it lingers as a reminder of what is at stake if hatred goes unanswered. And so, as we close this exploration, we are left with one enduring truth. The future will not be written by what might have been, but by the choices we make now, and whether we, like those before us, are willing to defend freedom, resist tyranny, and ensure that the world remains a place where the nightmares of the past never become the realities of tomorrow. So how do you think the balance of power would look today if Nazi Germany controlled Europe and actually won World War II? Let us know in the comments below.